This next session is one that I'm really excited about. This is Two-Spirit Reconciliation, Honoring the Truth, Reconciling for the Future. And for this session, we have Harlan Pruden and Bear Smith, and it is my pleasure to introduce both of them. And I'm going to give you both of their bios before you hear from them. So Harlan Pruden works with and for the Two-Spirit community locally, nationally, and internationally. Maybe I'll just have the door be shut, and then maybe latecomers can come in through the back. Rick, do you mind closing the door for me? Thank you. So currently Harlan is a PhD student at the University of British Columbia and is an educator at the BC Centre for Disease Control's Chimamuk program. Harlan is also the managing editor of the twospiritjournal.com, an interactive multi-platform Two-Spirit news site. Before moving to Vancouver from New York City, Harlan was a co-founder and former director of the Northeast Two-Spirit Society and the principal Two-Spirit consultant to USA's Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration's Tribal Training and Technical Assistance Center.
Oh my God, what a long name, right?
In 2014, Harlan was appointed by President Obama to the Presidential Advisory Council on HIV and AIDS, where he provided advice, information, and recommendations to the Secretary of Health and Human Services and the White House. In December 2017, Harlan, along with all of the remaining members, were fired by President Trump. Harlan is also a representative to the International Indigenous Peoples Working Group on HIV and AIDS. And closer to home, Harlan is a board member of Community, the home for Vancouver's LGBT, queer, and Two-Spirit community. And in January 2018, he was appointed by City of Vancouver as a member of the Board of Trustees for the Vancouver Public Library. Bear Smith is a proud member of the Tsimshian and Haisla Nations. Bear was born in Prince Rupert, whose mother is Myra Wilson of Hartley Bay. Bear grew up between the Terrace and Prince Rupert and then relocated to East Vancouver in 2003 to 2004, when he was 10 years old. Bear is honored to live, work, and play on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Coast Salish people, specifically the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam First Nations peoples' lands. Bear was born female, but now lives and identifies as a man and uses he, him, his pronouns. If I may quote Bear, "I guess that would make me transgender, but I've never identified as trans before." It is an honor to have Bear with us here today to share his teachings, truth, and experiences with us. So please welcome Harlan and Bear.
I just want to start off by thanking the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam First Nations for being on their territory.
Tanzai no chemtek Harlan e waka no mani e motor mouth Mabel. Niha nehiao niha ayakre. Greetings, my relatives and my friends. My government name is Harlan Pruden. My native name is Waka no Mani. It's in Sioux. I was doing some work on the Rosebud Reservation. But today, I have to be Motormouth Mabel because we have a lot of information to cover. I'm also First Nations Cree. In my humble opinion, that is the best nation in the whole wide world. And I am also Two-Spirit in my own language, Niha Ayakwe. I am Two-Spirit. And thank you very much, Bear, for doing that land acknowledgement. This land acknowledgement is not some sort of perfunctory statement that we say. This is us humbly acknowledging the fact that we are visitors, and because we were called into the room by our elder this morning, we are now guests on and in the Coast Salish's territory and land. If we did not do this land acknowledgement, I would liken it to me walking into your home and not acknowledging that I'm in your home. And if we carry that analogy forward, as I would start telling you how and when to clean your own house and how to live in your house. And so that's not what we want to do as guests in and on the Coast Salish territory. And then for myself is I take that statement to also position myself as an ambassador for my Cree people. If I don't carry myself in a good way, in an honorable way, you may think shitty things about me, but worse, you will think and may think shitty things of my Cree people. So I show up as an ambassador for my Cree people. And I think we all have people and we all represent people. So again, this statement is to really acknowledge the fact that I am a guest in and on their home. And although I am a member of the best nation in the whole wide world, sorry, Haisla nations, is that my protocols, my way, come second to my hosts. So I just want to be very clear with what we mean when we do a land acknowledgement. Mm-hmm. And a little bit about you and welcome.
Yeah, I'm from the Tsimshian and Haisla Nation. I work doing rebar. I'm trans and I'm a little bit nervous, so bear with me.
So, all right, so let's jump into this real quickly. Mm-hmm. Where are we going, or are we coming, or are we just breathing heavy now? So the first conversation that Bear and I are going to enter into is a conversation of what is and who is Two-Spirit, and we're just going to pop through that section. Then what I will do is pick up the conversation of looking at a framework to understand and to embrace and to operationalize a lens of reconciliation. It is a framework. I cannot tell you how that work looks like. That work is going to be your work. And then finally is just so that we can model what is some possibilities of reconciliation, or what we call as reconciliation, is an embodiment of some of that work through the Sex Now research.
Yeah, and here we have the concept of Two-Spirit. Two-Spirit is organizing, strategy, and not an identity. The term of Two-Spirit does not make sense unless it is contextualized within the Aboriginal Native framework and community. Two-Spirit within a traditional setting was a gender analysis and not a sexual orientation. Today, most people associate the term LGBT with LGBT Native peoples. However, the work of the Two-Spirit organization's leaders, elders, and community members is more within the traditional understanding.
So thank you so much, Bear. Again, what is key to this is that there cannot be one definition of what is Two-Spirit or who is Two-Spirit. Two-Spirit is an organizing tool or a strategy or a placeholder for us as community organizers that want to work with people who are indigenous to Turtle Island and who currently identify as LGBTQ, gender and non-conforming, same gender loving, intersex, all of those concepts, queer. And it's the intersectionality that opens up the possibility for someone to answer the word two, the call of Two-Spirit. If you're not indigenous to Turtle Island and you're not LGBTQI, you cannot use the term Two-Spirit. And why? That sounds harsh, right? But as a community organizer that's trying to work with today's LGBTQ and QQI indigenous communities, is if everyone and anyone can use that term, how do I do my job of community organizing indigenous people who are LGBT and queer if everyone and anyone can use that term? Now that said, if there are parts of this talk that you can glean from and learn, and the current regime and identities are not working for you, I will fully support you to learn from us, and we would be more than honored to share those teachings and that we saw at the beginning from Shane of sharing this land. And that you come up with your own term. You can do that. Write your own path. And the queer community has been doing that and doing that amazingly since the time immemorial. And I will be there to fight, defend, and honor whatever your term is, and I hope that that would be mirrored in the fighting and the honoring of our Two-Spirit work and the term Two-Spirit. So where did Two-Spirit come from? So those nations that had a Two-Spirit tradition, many of our traditional Native communities, as Bear said, had more than two genders. Some nations only had two genders, some nations had 3, 4, 5, 6, and some nations had 7 different genders. For those nations that had 7 different genders, we had our own words within our own languages to account, to name, and to single out who our two-spirit relatives were. And I modeled that at the beginning of this talk when I said, I am two-spirit. Niha, I am a Yahweh. That is our word for who I am. And so we had our own words within our own languages. And then I put like 1492, because that's kind of like a big year for us, right? That's when we were discovered. By CC. I don't even use his real name anymore, right? Here we are just rambling around on our big old continent, right? And then CC goes, I have discovered you. I'm like, thank God, we were lost for so many, many years. The real story that we share is that in 1492, the indigenous people of Hispaniola, they woke up and they discovered CC on their shores. That's the real story. And so we just want to make sure that we're holding that space. So around 1492 to around 1989, 1990, the term Berdache was used. Berdache was a French word. There was these French missionaries that were wandering around Turtle Island, and they found these individuals that were like maybe wearing a man's top and a woman's skirt. Then there were like male-assigned individuals that are hanging out and doing the work of women, and female-assigned individuals are hanging out and doing the work of males. And the French missionaries are like, this doesn't fit into my rigid binary gender system in which that there are only man and women, just like the good book said, God made Adam and Eve, not Adam and Steve, right? So they're like, what do we call them? What do we call them? So there was this Persian word, barja, that was spread throughout Europe. It first showed up in Italian, bardasso. Then it showed up in Spanish, bardaxa. And then in the early 16th century, about 1525, it shows up in French as berdache. But if we go back to that Persian word barja, it literally translates into a young man or boy who serves as another succubus. Y'all have to Google that word because it's a crazy ass word, okay? Succubus. Or permitting sodomy to be committed upon him, or another way of saying it is a passive homosexual partner. Let's keep this real for a sec, right? On man hot sex, and we hope it's hot, right? Because it's just a waste of time when it's not, right? Bush or no bush, right? There is a passive bottom, and when the bottom's not passive, we call those power bottoms for lazy tops, right? What they were narrowly talking about is what we would say in medical terms is the anal male receptive partner, i.e. the bottom. And so for many, many years, and much research was invested in this nomenclature of berdache. There was even organizing efforts of berdache organizations that popped up in the United States. But starting in 1975 with the founding of the Gay American Indian organization in the Bay Area by Barbara Cameron and Randy Burns, as well as other community leaders, there was a consciousness that started to take hold. And it culminated at the 3rd annual Basket and Bow Gathering in 1989 in Albert McLeod. Albert, were you at that meeting?
Yes, I was.
This is amazing that we have someone that is at that historic meeting. At that historic meeting, a grand council was called, a talking circle. And they said, we hate this word berdache. It is base. It's all about sex, and it's about a particular role within sex. It's French. No, they didn't say that. They also said, it's all about he and him. It's not honoring, respectful, or mindful of our two-spirit sisters. And for many, many other reasons, they rejected the term. But then they said, how do we organize? So after many, many rounds and much discussions, they landed on the term two-spirit. They wanted a term that reflected a combination of both masculinity and femininity, which attributed to males in feminine roles and females in masculine roles. And there you get a pivot. The pivot was around your role within society, not who you're having sex with and not what type of sex you're having. And it's hearkening back to this gender analysis, and it was about this traditional understanding of who were we within a pre-contact setting. It's also incredibly important to note that it was a political statement. It was a statement of sovereignty of body and sovereignty of land. The community was like saying, you ethnographers, you French missionaries, you historians and academics that are doing the research under that nomenclature, you have no right to name us. That right belongs to us, and we choose two-spirit. Now, the Academy freaked out, and they continued on publishing up until around 1995-96 around the term berdache. If you see the term Berdache, we find it offensive, we don't like it, and in your mind's eye, you should just cross it out and write two-spirit. Not two-spirited, we're not a verb. Not two-spiritness, we're not an adjective. We're a noun, two-spirit. So how do we conceive of a world that has more than two genders? So these are a list, and each one of these items is attributed to a nation. And I'm only going to talk about two nations. I'm going to talk about the Cree Nation, and I'm going to talk about the Sioux Nation. So for us, if I were to make you all a part of the Cree Nation, first of all, how does it feel to be a part of the best nation in the whole wide world? Pretty rockin', right? So the way that us Crees, how we worked is we had two big dominant camps or two big dominant societies. And so if I split the room in half, I'm going to make you all over here on this side a part of our women's camp. Y'all gather. On this side of the room, y'all are part of our men's camp. You all hunt. Now, it's also important to note, we actually don't have translations for man or woman. We had community roles. Y'all on this side are the carriers of water, the givers of life, is our literal translation. Y'all on this side of the room, y'all are keepers of the fire, and you had your role as keepers of the fire. The way that us Crees also worked is that a man or a keeper of the fire was never allowed in the water camp, and the water camp was never allowed into the fire camp. And so if there was ever imbalance or disharmony, a man couldn't walk over to the woman's camp, and a woman couldn't walk over to the man's camp. And so us as two-spirit people, we had unfettered and equal access to both camps. And so literally, if there was imbalance or disharmony, we could roll over to the water camp and we were like, hey, what's going on? What's happening, women? Float over to the men's camp and we were like, hey, what's happening? What's going on? And literally, we could float back and forth and restore balance and be the mediators for our two big camps. A woman couldn't do this. A man couldn't do this. Just us as two-spirit people could do this. Now, we want to romanticize that. And that would be like romanticizing the work of our water keepers or romanticizing the work of our fire keepers. Our role was just a different role. No more valued or equal, it was just different. And in that respect, we were just like everyone else, except we just had a different role within society and different gifts and or medicines to offer our people. So we were just an equal. If I were Sioux, there wouldn't be necessarily an social expectation of me being a mediator. There would be a social expectation that I would be the officiant of a naming ceremony, and I would give our folks names. And so Native people can have 4 names. Public, English public, Native public, and these last 2 names are incredibly special. The third name category is if you sit in ceremony and you sit in ceremony with the same people, you may take a ceremonial name that you were only known by that name in that setting of the ceremony. And then the last name is so incredibly important, and you hear it only a couple of times. It is the name in which that you know the Creator and the Creator knows you. And so when it's time for you to go home, the Creator calls you by that name, and that's when you go. And so he puts you in direct relationship with the Creator. And as a Sioux, my good friend Del First has resurrected that ceremony as a wink day for his people and is doing that naming ceremony. The takeaway from this one slide is if you're Anishinaabe, Two-Spirit is going to mean something different within, or Ojibwe. Ojibwe or Anishinaabe. Or for me, it's Cree. For someone who's Shinsham or Haisla or Coast Salish, you're going to have a different role. And that's why there is not one way of being Two-Spirit, and Two-Spirit cannot be an identity, cannot be an endpoint. It is the beginning of that discussion, and it is rooted within our own nation. It's nation-specific.
All right, so the following is approximately 130 terms for Two-Spirit in our traditional languages that we will continue to work to grow as we do this work within our communities.
And we heard that this morning. How beautiful was that that gift and that honor that we got for that Two-Spirit word in Hunkameum by Shane and the other elder this morning. It made my heart so happy to hear these new words. The Cree entry, Clean entries validated by 21 Cree primary speakers.
And then we were recently gifted this neutralness word from our good friend Michael.
And again, these words haven't been spoken in over a century.
We were recently gifted the
Guasla.
word as well. And I happen to get a lead on my nation's word as well, but I'm still in the process of confirming it.
Bear and I just did some work with our program at the BC CDC's, my program, the men's health training. And at the health training, although we had 1 hour to do our Two-Spirit talk, Bear and I talked for 2.5 hours, and we were gifted this new word for the Guasla Nation, which is a huge language category for this area. And so it again makes our hearts so happy to see these new words and breathing life into these new words.
Yeah, all these words are so important. For where there is a word, there's a culture, a people. Often our Two-Spirit relatives feel forced into making a false decision between being LGBT and being Native, usually just running off to an urban setting like here to be LGBT. Then one day they could show up at a Two-Spirit talk like this one and have the opportunity to learn of these words and framework to understand and contextualize their own word. We are doing this work and research to encourage people to find out if their nation has a name for Two-Spirit so that one day our relatives don't have to choose between being Native and being LGBT.
They are medicine. These words are so, and it centers our ingenuity and centers and roots us in who we are as Indigenous people from specific nations. And so this work and these words that we share with you are the root of this work. And it also shows that there's a history for us.
Yeah, so there are roughly 20 known images of our Two-Spirit people. I wish we had more than that, but here are 8 of them.
This image right here is one of the only Canadian images. It's from Moose, it's called Treaty 4 territory, Carlisle, Saskatchewan, or Moose Mountain. And it has a lot of questions, and part of my research is to try to figure out what's going on in that picture. And we put ourselves in here also. My fly is open. I don't know why I have to say that all the time. But how round is Bear? Bear looks like a Care Bear at this point. So there's no way of understanding or getting an appreciation, and I say that word very lightly, of our experience, unless we understand what is truly going on in this picture. This picture is of the Carlisle Indian Industrial School. This is the first school of its type. It's an Indian residential boarding school that opened in 1879 and closed in 1918. Some fun facts. About 100,000 children went through the doors of this one school from approximately 140 different nations. Do you know how many students they graduated? 158 total. That is a graduation rate of 0.158%. But yet it was hailed as a huge success. We get that famous saying, kill the Indian to save the man. Or it was the failed forcible assimilation of our Native American children into removing the Native, and all that was left was American. And literally, these children had their Indianness beaten out of them. So what does this have to do with the Two-Spirit community? This has everything, and this has nothing to do with the Two-Spirit community. And both of those realities hold true. If we deconstruct and look at this picture, if you'll notice on the top 3/4 of the picture is that all the young men and boys have short hair and are wearing pants. On the bottom third, all of the young women and girls have long hair and are wearing dresses. And it is that imposition of that rigid binary gender system that was imposed upon the Turtle Island's Indigenous people. We as Two-Spirit people weren't forced to the margins. We were forced completely out of this framework. Gone are the third, fourth, fifth, sixth, and seventh different genders, leaving room for only their two genders. That is why it has everything, and it also has nothing to do with the Two-Spirit community. And they're not oppositional. Those two realities exist in this one image. Now, so many people, I know that you've been talking about the truth and reconciliation, and these stories are coming into your consciousness. And so many people want to dismiss this and say, what does this matter? Like, this school opened in 1879 and closed in 1918, and it was opened in the States. Duncan Scott sent down a team down to the school, learned from the school, and then they replicated that model here in Canada. And then what did they do? Grabbed my mother from the Beaver Lake Indian Reserve, put her into the Poundmakers Lodge, and literally beat the Indian shit out of her. And then what did she do? She had 3 beautiful children, and she beat the living shit out of us. She wasn't spoken with love. She didn't speak to us with love. She didn't know kindness, so she didn't treat us with kindness. And so for many, many, many years, there was such a dark place in my heart for this woman who was supposed to be my mother, And all I had was contempt and hate for her. And it wasn't as I started looking at this picture that I was like, oh, my mother was only doing that which she knew. Today, there's not love, but there is compassion, understanding, and a deep appreciation for her story and her journey. For us, it's a historical trauma, bleeds into intergenerational trauma, and kicks off the cycles of abuse that we are still dealing with today. Any Indigenous person can track back to what we're going back here. And it is from this, out of all of the pictures that you've seen, this is the one that informs and gets me up out of bed every morning, gives me my marching orders, to restore that which was that was taken from us. It's clear. But it is also for the deep commitment to either help me with my healing walk, but also helping other Native people with their healing walk. We cannot continue on blaming colonization. We must begin that healing walk, and we must walk in a way that is of our way. And so this morning, I just Shane's words really touched me and made my eyes sweat a little bit, right? In welcoming you to this territory. For him not to do that and to speak unkindly of you would be replicating and mirroring how you all have treated us. And if Shane were to do that, he would be saying that colonization has won and has changed him in his Musqueam ways. And for that, we must always walk into life of how is me that I have to put a hand out and bridge and build that community with you. But know that sometimes it is such a hard burden to carry. Sometimes I'm angry. But for me to act on that anger would be no better than what has happened to us. So how do we work together, and how do we stand in community together? And stand on community that is honoring of my Cree way, but also honoring of all of us as Indigenous people. We must stay true to who we are. You must stay true to who you are. But how do we build bridges of respect, compassion, and ultimately love? Because we are stuck together, and what binds us, as Shane reminds us, is this land, Natsamath. One.
All right. These are 2 pictures of the same person. His name is Tom Torino. On the left picture, we have him with long hair, feminine adornment like the necklace and shawl, earrings. And then on the right side, we have him with a suit and tie and short hair. This is all because it didn't fit in with the westernized standards. This would be called gender policing. Even today, people all over experience this gender policing. Growing up, I remember being forced, kicking and screaming to put on a dress to go to church. I was never allowed to have short hair until I cut it all off myself and started my life statement of who I am inside.
Thank you. So we've been talking a little bit about historical trauma, Oh, just a little more fun facts. This is only a 3-year period, 1885 to 1882. Like, my goodness, right? What changes? We actually don't know whether or not Tom Torino was Narle or Two-Spirit or not. This is just like stock, publicly available PSAs extolling the virtues of the residential boarding school. So, historical trauma. There are many definitions of historical trauma, and the one that sits well with the framework and that informs my work is from Joseph P. Gong, who's Gross Ventre in that M state, Montana. I always get that confused with Manitoba. And I added to Joseph's definition. Historical trauma is defined by Joseph as a combination of immense losses and traumatic events that are perpetrated upon an entire culture. And what I added was what's unique about historical trauma, it is man-made, 100% man-made. This is not like Hurricane Michael slamming into the Carolinas and wiping it out. This is done through policies, by laws and regulations, and other apparatuses, including the criminal injustice system that backs up those laws, policies, and regulations. For Native people, these include the losses of culture, language, land, people from diseases and wars, ways of life, economic systems, ceremonies, and family structures. My question for you all is, what else was taken from us as Native people? Our Two-Spirit people were taken from us. But I resist the temptation of putting a separate call-out bullet point and saying Two-Spirit, because we don't need to have a separate bullet point. What we've seen in really in broad swathy terms of how we're in the culture, 9 slides of how we are in the language and how new words and languages are coming back to life. How we have a sacred relationship to our land that is unique to us as Two-Spirit people, and also we are a person. We have ways of life. We had an economic role within our societies. We had our own ceremonial roles, like naming ceremonies, and we were in every family. And that last component, that last point of family structures is such an incredibly important point, because it is your family structures that is the key building blocks for societies and nations. When your family is being ripped apart, how do you build a healthy nation or healthy societies? You can't. Unlike the broader LGBT queer movement, the non-Indigenous queer movement is either asking for new rights and new privileges, or an expansion of a Western right or Western privilege. So a new right would be gender-neutral washrooms within the public domain. An expansion of a Western right is same-sex civil marriage. Now, I'm not being critical. I'm merely making an observation so that we can have it as a discussion point. And also the work of the broader non-Indigenous queer movement is theoretical, a dreaming and or aspirational work for a better tomorrow. It's theoretical. For us within the Two-Spirit community is that we are not asking for anything anew. Where we begin the conversation is, remember when I would have been known as an Ayakwe? Remember when, for our Shinsham people, our Two-Spirit people would have had a role within their nation? And it is not theoretical, it is about a lived experience and it is historical. And thereby our conversation must be decolonial, and it also must be a centering and rooting from our ingenuity. And so that is a subtle yet radically different way of entering into the conversation. So I would like you to hold that thought for when we move and pivot to the conversation of reconciliation.
All right, what is being done today to bring back the old Two-Spirit role? Gay American Indians, San Francisco. What?
It started in 1975.
Yeah.
Just say a lot's going on.
Yeah. There we go, lots going on.
The one thing is that for the Two-Spirit people are being included in diversity celebrations and other events just like today's gathering. Welcome. Y'all are now a part of this movement. And for that, I raise my hand in gratitude.
Sorry. Here we have some examples of wellness work, the Two-Spirit Journal and a couple other powwows and stuff. And then we have some books here as well, and a couple movies.
Some amazing movies. Fire Song, if you haven't seen it, host a film night. It is beautiful, set in northern Ontario on a reservation. It is a beautiful, beautiful story. And for our northern brothers and sisters from the Inuit, it is this beautiful documentary called Two Soft Things, Two Hard Things. Some amazing resources that are new. Johnny Appleseed, a new book that's just out. So there's some really cool resources we get to see ourselves of who we are within our reality, within literature. Literature is so incredibly important because it is nation building. When we see ourselves, we can celebrate who we are. This is our nation building. If you would like more to drill down, if you just go to the Two-Spirit Resource Directory, use the little search engine, type in resources, and do a query, the first thing that will pop up is a whole page of resources. The Two-Spirit Journals, Two-Spirit Resource Directory, as well as one from Lakewood University, O'Brien. What's O'Brien? She came up with a female Two-Spirit resource dedicated to our Two-Spirit sisters. And then there's also a webinar that's recorded on YouTube that you'll find on this page for you to drill in a little harder. All right, thank you.
Yes.
And now I'm going to talk about reconciliation. Oh my goodness. All right, I'm going to really motor mouth Babel, right? Truth and reconciliation. Starting off with Rye Morgan, is that you can't delegate reconciliation. You have to own it. Whoever you are as an individual, a leader, or a group, or an organization, there are calls to action that relate to you. What got us here is policies and laws and regulations. We cannot think our way out of reconciliation. Reconciliation must have agency and action, and that's why we call it reconciliation. Now, so many people, there are two interrelating concepts with truth and reconciliation. There's truth, which is understanding our history. That's the easy, uncomfortable, but easier part of that. Reconciliation is a rewriting, writing to R-I-G-H-T to make good, or W-R-I-H-T, rewriting of policies and programs, and getting into better relations with Canada's Indigenous peoples as settlers. And for also reconciliation, it is two contiguous conversations. For us as Native people in the room, we know our history. We butt up against it every day. For us, we have nothing to reconcile. What we have to do is either to continue or to do our healing journey and our healing walk. That is our work, and it is hard work. For non-Native people, their charge is to learn our history, our collective history on this land that binds us, and then to reconcile that history with today so they do not repeat this history and become today's colonizers. For your work, all of your work, no matter where you are positionally, should and must begin with Indigenous peoples' frames, understandings, and our ways. And as a result of that, you will have a fundamentally different conversation because it begins with us. And yes, it will be unsettling the settler from within, as Paulette Regan says so beautiful in her book. Your work must begin with us. Now, reconciling the future. Now, you heard this morning with Rocky talking about UNDRIP. I challenge you that if you really, really want to dig in, there's 3 interrelating documents that would help you with reconciliation. First of all, if you just Google the foundations, the principles of truth and reconciliation, you will find 10 principles. Hold those, because those are the framework. Then pick up what Rocky was talking about for UNDRIP and the United Nations Declaration on Indigenous Peoples. That provides a, what is it? I'm losing the word. not the framework. It offers you another framework until I get the word. And then there it is. The 10 principles is a foundation. The UNDRIP provides a framework. And then when you go to the 94 calls to action, they'll be more rooted, grounded, and supported with your engagement with them. And you have to hold all 3 of those documents in play when looking at reconciliation. Also, Ry Morgan said that you cannot just take out one recommendation, one call to action. You have to look at all 94 as one big puzzle. And you have to hold all 94 in play at the same time with your framework and with the foundation. Yes, it's hard work, but that is the mission and the charge that we call upon. Now, there is not really a lot of definitions of reconciliation. And so my good friend and boss, Jessica Chenery, we came up with this, our own term. And we called it reconciliation because it has to have a notion of agency. Reconciliation is simply the intentional, reflective, communal self-examination of our ongoing action or journey as we chart a new way forward together. What does that mean? It is simple. If it is based on love, respect, and honoring of who we are, where there's an acknowledgement of the sacred space that dwells between as also within all of us. It's intentional. It's going to take thought, and you have to sit and think long and hard about that. It is reflective. Y'all are not going to get this right the first time. And so if you make and step in a big old steaming pile of poo, right? Say, oops, and we'll say, ouch. But then what we'll do is, if a mistake is only a mistake if you don't learn from it. And so we want to invoke a spirit of generosity so that we can support this reflectiveness as we figure out this way together. It is communal and self-examination. That sounds like it's that tension, right? But that statement is a native understanding of like what's good for you is good for me, and what is good for me is good for you. And we must start thinking that way. Not all about me, or not all about you, but a communal self-examination of our ongoing action or journey. That's where that agency comes in, as we chart a new way forward together. And I think that's what reconciliation asks us and charges us to do. Reconciliation is going to look something different if you work for a health agency to if you work in a school district. So all we can offer is a framework. You have to breathe reconciliation into your context. And thereby, reconciliation is going to be multidimensional, and it will look fundamentally different given where you are and who you are and where you taking up that conversation of reconciliation. All right, reconciliation embodied. That's a wardrobe change. I was hoping that there wouldn't be some sort of malfunction and like Janet Jackson, and I'd be like. So for this next section, I'm really awkwardly I'm the only person up here, and I don't feel that I have the right to be the only person up here. I want to acknowledge Travis Sawe and Teddy. Where is Teddy? Right there, Teddy, and Jenny, who is not here today. She's visiting in a remote community. But these are my colleagues at the BC Centre for Disease Control. And we started this research project looking at the respondents of the 2014-2015 Sex Now data research. And what was really cool about this is we took an Indigenous approach to this work. And when Travis and I met, and then we met with Jenny and Teddy, we said, we don't want epidemiology, we don't want calculators, we want people. And we want your whole humanity because you bring a whole gifts to this. And for our epidemiologists, I know they were geeking out and they're like coefficient this and regression that, and I was just like, what? but that's their gift, right? And so I said, you are going to know data better than we are. And so if you see us chasing our tail, say it. Bring your humanity. And so we had this really kind of cool where we all had voices and we all had an equal place at the table. And the research fundamentally looked different. And the other thing that we did was that unlike there was 8,000 respondents in the 2014-2015 data set. And normally how research is done is you pull out the Aboriginal respondents, and there was 365 respondents, and you do this compare and contrast, Aboriginal respondents to this broader data set, right? The other gay, bi, and MSM data set. But if you look at this is a structural imbalance. Because try as you might, we're never going to be white. And so what we did was we ignored all of the other 7,000 respondents and we looked at the 365 respondents as a whole. And then what we did was we did intra-comparison. And so some of the questions we asked couldn't be answered because the survey didn't ask them. And so we prepared a report and we sent that to Nate, and Nate accepted all of our suggestions and amended the 2018-2019 survey instrument. And because our community I saw that the effort was being made, is I said that I would help recruit folks to participate in the 2018-2019, and then having Nate's support to go to various prides. And so, although we have many questions, what we did was we landed on and wanted to look at the drivers of sexual health knowledge for two-spirit, gay, bi, and other Native men who have sex with men. And we're so excited to present this. This is the second time out. So here is the HIV prevention toolkit with all of the various interventions broken down into two major categories of medical and then physical or behavioral interventions. For our theoretical understanding to form this work is there's a Sioux expression, mitakuyosin. And mitakuyosin is the direct translation is all my relatives, but I think a more nuanced translation is everything is connected or everything is one. And so as a result of the way we looked at the data is that you could not just pull out one item and think that that would give you a picture, that all of this happens, and especially when we're looking at sexual health knowledge, it happens within a context. And that we must look at all the various drivers or interrelating drivers. Now, you all may know that as syndemics. We would just humbly refer to it as mitakuyosin, and something that we have been doing for many, 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 many years. So the research question is how do social, spiritual, and environmental factors relate to sexual health knowledge for two-spirit, gay, bi, and other Native men who have sex with men? In this study, a group of us sought to use mitakuyosin as a framework to better understand the drivers of sexual health knowledge about two-spirit, gay, bi, and Native MSMs. Some of us doing this research are Native and some of us were not. And we borrowed upon the strengths of both Indigenous and settler ways of knowing as we approach the known. This approach is also known as two-eyed seeing, which you can kind of see both. And we tried to straddle and not betray either, but to find that mediating space between Western ways, Western ontologies, and Indigenous ontologies. Sex Now, how we did the work was that you already heard from Nate. We were looking at the 2014-2015 data set. There were a total of 365 respondents who identified as First Nations, Métis, or Inuit, and they formed our group of analysis. Our outcome was sexual health knowledge, and we created a score by assigning 1 point for knowing each of the following, either condoms, ARVs, PEP, PrEP, as well as treatment as prevention. Mitakuyosin meets statistics, and this is that two-eyed seeing. As you can see, the drivers we studied were interrelated amongst the samples of the 365 two-spirit and GBMSM Native and Indigenous men. Specifically, those living in urban environments had a larger gay peer network, and those with higher educational attainment had more income, of course, And those with larger social networks had higher levels of education attainment and a larger gay peer network. Here we can see the distribution of sexual health knowledge for each of the 6 items. A large majority of the respondents had awareness of the first 3 items related to condom, HIV treatment effectiveness, and HIV criminalization. Knowledge about PEP, PrEP, and treatment as prevention were closer to 50%. Something that will be more important to monitor as for future survey, as well as PrEP being available now it's nationally available for First Nations and Inuit people since February 6th, 2016. If you're First Nations and you're Inuit, and it doesn't matter where you live in this country, you have access to publicly funded PrEP. And you've had access to it for over 2 years. Variables associated with sexual health knowledge, all Indigenous respondents. Overall, we found that 4 factors were associated with greater sexual health knowledge. Income, education, the size of the gay peer network were all positively associated with sexual health knowledge, while age was inversely associated. In other words, younger men reported higher sexual health knowledge scores. Living environment, urban versus rural or on and off reservation, is important, what we found from looking at this data. In 2004, although the 2004 survey did not measure whether or not the respondents lived on reserve, they only had a rural remote versus urban. This is something that we changed with Nate's support and also the work that we did as a committee. And the 2018 survey did ask now whether or not the person or First Nations people live on reservation. But with the data we had on whether men who lived in urban and non-urban environments, this really mattered. And you can see here, in particularly, we saw an association between Two-Spirit respondents and greater sexual health knowledge amongst those living in urban environments, but not among those living outside of urban settings. So a wrap-up of the results. So what does this all mean? First, sexual health knowledge was related to income, education, and gay peer networks. This raises the question, how do we bring up sexual health knowledge for Indigenous men who have lower levels of education or income and who are not connected or plugged into the gay community? That's a recommendation for you all to take up. Secondly, urban and rural environments was important. Two-Spirit respondents had higher sexual health knowledge than other Native men in urban settings, but not in non-urban settings. This could have something to do with the access to information. Two-Spirit is, in fact, a community organizing strategy or tool. This means that Two-Spirit folks who are likely to be connected to one another and may have a better information related to HIV prevention technologies. By comparison, Two-Spirit folks who have harder times using this strength in rural settings, that they may have experienced some isolation or separation due to the lasting impacts of colonization and colonialist ideas about gender and sex. And third is that we need to keep looking at this, and we need a larger data cycle. And I know that from the Winnipeg site, I think that we had a 30% Aboriginal respondents at that one site. So I know the team. So we are so excited of looking at the comparison between the online 2014-2015 with the online to the actual paper in-person data collection, and there's going to be so much richness so that we can figure out what is going on in our community that can inform praxis or inform policies and programs. I'd also like to say that it was at the Winnipeg gathering that we got to meet Lee. And Lee is visiting here from Winnipeg, and he is going to be sharing his story of recovery and his story of, I'll say, survivance. Actually, it's more than survivance. It's more than survival and resistance. It is his tenacity, his courage to thrive. And so we are so honored to have Lee in our presence to share their story of recovery and their continuing story of recovering. And so I just would like to raise my hands to Lee and say thank you from the bottom of my heart. So that leaves us with the rewriting of our relations. Again, it is that work that we were doing with Travis, Teddy, and Jenny was an embodiment of the 18, 19, and 20 calls to action. The 18th one is recognizing and implementing a healthcare rights for Aboriginal people. We have some recommendations for you all to do that. 19 is to measure goals and to identify and close those gaps. We will be in a better position once we start digging into the 2018-2019 compared to the 2014 Sex Now data. But these were serving as a model for you all of what this can look like. And then finally is that looking at the distinct health needs of Métis, Inuit, and off-reserve Aboriginal people. And we got that with looking at the urban and rural remote, but now in the 2018 we'll be looking at reservation folks. And so it is reconciliation, yes, it's difficult, but it's also incredibly simple. And so with that, references, not because I have to do that because I'm a PhD student. I used to be able just to say my granny said before. And how we say in Cree a formal thank you is kinonas kumtinin na wawa. Examaga is how we say goodbye.
And how we say thank you in Tsimshian is toyak stanun. So thank you.
Thank you.